Richard, who some of you may know, was trained as an architect and then went on to train as an architectural historian, all of it at the University of California, Berkeley, in the great state of California. Richard has taught in architecture schools in the US and in Europe for a number of years, first at Rice University for 10 years in Houston, which is in the news, and it's not a coincidence, I don't think. And then for the past 15 years or so in Italy, teaching for the Syracuse program in Italy, as well as in Ferrara and at the Politecnico in Milan. And I've been asked to mention that he's happiest at the Politecnico. Now, there are three reasons why he's particularly appropriate tonight. The first is that Richard is a historian of architecture. He studied under Spiro Kostov, a great architectural historian who wrote the important textbook, Architectural History, Settings and Rituals. And Richard's own PhD was on the ritual use of public space in Renaissance Rome. Now, this approach, as you may know, to architectural history developed by Kostov at UC Berkeley. It was very attentive to the way people live, the meaning of architecture, and not only to the list of great architects, the canon, we'll say. So Richard produced research in this context, and most recently, he published a book called World Architecture, A Cross-Cultural History. Now, this book began as a rewriting of Kostov's standard textbook, which is used in architecture schools all over North America. It was my textbook, actually, for architectural history. And Richard started rewriting it for a third edition, and in rewriting it realized that there was a whole new book to write, in which the hierarchies amongst cultures would be addressed and eliminated as much as possible. So to talk about learning with the world, we thought it was very appropriate to have the historian of a cross-cultural history of architecture. Second reason, second of three, so I'm getting to the end, don't worry. Second reason is that Richard was the founding editor in 1988 of a very important journal called the Design Book Review in the US. And for 15 years, he oversaw this publication, which was an important actor in debates about all aspects of design and the environment for the English-speaking world, in any case. So he's particularly appropriate to animate a debate for us, to put things on the table, to make controversies, and to help us discover new ideas and perhaps new people and new places, developing important actions and activities in the world today. A third reason is that Richard has, for a long time, been what we could call, but which word he doesn't like, an environmentalist, or in any case, someone very concerned with ecology and the environment. He's been a member of the Sierra Club, an important environmental association, since the age of 18. He is, I didn't know this, I knew Richard from a while back, but I didn't know that aspect of his engagement. I think it's been sharpened in recent years with many things happening in the world. So he's an activist. You know, Richard is really an activist for the environment, and I think that's one of the parameters that's making us realize that all over the world we need to work together because we're all in the same boat. In a way, it's particularly appropriate that Richard addresses us tonight. An important book that he published in 2004 in Italian and then in 2006 in English was called Sprawl Town, which created some debate because in it, Richard says that we need to expect this new phase of urbanization, sprawl, as a necessary phase of a historical fact in urbanization. So I think he's going to talk a little bit about that situation that we're in tonight. So these are the reasons. We've asked Richard to synthesize these three things: the world architectural historian, the animator of debates in the architectural world, and the engaged citizen for environmental concerns in the sense of social, economic, and ecological sustainability. With one last note is that it's particularly pleasing for me to introduce him tonight because when I was a long time ago in a land far away, when I was a young student, a young graduate, had been working a bit and wanted to do grad school, I was accepted at Rice University and told I should go, told by someone for whom I have a lot of respect, that I should go because I could study with Richard Ingersoll. I arrived in Houston in August of 1998 after having spoken with Richard on the phone and set a bunch of things up. And when I got to Rice and asked to see him, they said, oh, Richard left. He moved to Italy. So he picked up and abandoned me. So it's with a little bit of revenge that I invited Richard to address you. But let bygones be bygones. Forgive and forget. It's a real pleasure, really, sincerely, to introduce Richard Ingersoll. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Many thanks. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to Kent and Carlos who organized, and Melanie Kovas, and mes salutations à Martin Chenot, tous les Français, mais je ne vais pas parler en français, mais ça peut être possible, peut-être, si vous voulez me faire des demandes. E poi la direttrice del Politecnico del mio dipartimento, Ilaria Valente, è qua, quindi la saluto perché è qui. E tutti gli altri. Non ho mai partecipato in questa organizzazione che è la AEEA o le EAAE. C'è questa grande confusione, tipicamente, this very confusing, typically European. You know, I love this idea that we have many different ways of calling whatever this organization is. And as I prepared, I was thinking, what could I possibly tell this group of highly intelligent and very knowledgeable professionals that they don't already know? And my conclusion was nothing. Niente, rien. But please don't leave, because I have a story to tell, and it has to do with our lives and those of our students. And the title of my talk is Cool Architecture. I'm sure you hear your students say cool all the time. Cool, but this could be literally cool, or this could be metaphorically cool, we'll see. Lessons from the world, because Kent asked me to do that, so I'll try to give some lessons from the world. And in this, of course, it's a lot of propaganda. But propaganda, as you know, makes everybody feel good. We accept propaganda. It's not going to change your mind, but what I would like to do is perhaps make you reconsider the order of things. So most of us are very well aware of the rapacious development that has occurred during the last 50 years, the incessant drilling, the chemical transformations, the carbon effusions that has permitted us, for the highest standard of living ever possible, for the greatest amount of people. We could never be who we are today without all of this, but of course it's caused irreversible damage to the ecosphere that is pushing global temperatures beyond all hope. So we recognize this contrast. Thus, we all know what the problem is, what causes it, and what we can expect from climate change. Yet we must continue to live with a sort of remorse because, for instance, I must fly to Bordeaux and therefore contribute to 4% of global warming in the process in order to warn you against global warming. So, of course, we're living in complete contradictions. This is what we call denial. We are all part of a denial system. To this dilemma, I would like to raise 3 caveats. The first, although we think that architecture is very important, and architecture can save the world, and I hope that architects will continue to give great beauty and comfort to the world, architecture is of very little consequence in the balance of things. And architects have very little power to make the crucial decisions. Second of all, no matter how virtuous an individual becomes in terms of personal global footprint, vegan, cyclist, solar-powered, this has little impact when only 25 companies in the world, state or private-owned companies, produce 50% of global warming. The corporations are really what determines the whole balance of greenhouse gases. China Coal, for instance, produces 14% of greenhouse gases. Aramco from Arabia, Exxon, Mobil, BP, Shell, Gazprom, Pemex, Coal India, and even Nigerian National Petroleum, plus Abu Dhabi, Venezuela, Iran, and all sorts of international companies are contributing 50% and probably up to 70% if you count the 100 companies that are producing this. Does that mean that we should all become great ecologists? Perhaps we need to organize politically against these 100 companies that are doing all the damage. Third, even if we organize consumers into responsible communities with zero impact transportation, alternative energy, and a sharing economy, this has relatively little importance when the power of the world is concentrated in the wealth of so few. 10% of the current population owns 86% of the wealth. Oxfam claims that only 8 billionaires, which include data tycoons Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and Larry Elliott, maybe you know these names, Bill Gates you must know, own more than the bottom 50% of the world. So 8 people own more than 50% of the planet. What difference can the individual make against such odds? That's the question we have to ask. Even if the data tycoons are self-proclaimed green advocates, Bill Gates has a very green house, for instance. Mark Zuckerberg is trying to make his headquarters into a very green headquarter. But they, in fact, are amassing this huge amount of wealth that is, in a way, the question: how do we redistribute this wealth? Apple, Facebook, Google, IKEA have all committed 100% renewable energy within the next 5 years. Are these companies good or are they bad? Now, I have 3 answers to these 3 caveats. First, architects, especially students, should be looking beyond the parameters of the profession. There's not going to be any work for architects, or very little work in the future. They must branch out. There must be a plan B. This is what we need to teach people, how to be more flexible. It's the secret to human organization, flexibility. 2, the world entity should be taxing $15 per kilo of all profligate energy producers until they change. How will this happen? Through political organization. We must organize. Bottom up, top down, it doesn't matter, but we need to organize. 3, eat the rich. Demand the return to the social state for more equitable redistribution of wealth, or else wait for the charitable benefits of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So rather than wait for that, perhaps we should organize to change such a situation. So I thought of talking about cool architecture, first with this idea that for me, the greatest architecture in the world are trees. Plant life preceded us for millions of years. It will continue after we're gone. And all the great lessons that we could perhaps learn in the world has to be in this tree. Stefano Mancuso, a really interesting plant neurologist, will convince you that plants are superior to human beings. We are violent. Plants are not violent. They know how to get along. A new metaphor is emerging that you can call the vegetal. Not the vegetable, but the vegetal, which could be a whole new system of organizing things. So we should think like a tree. It would be nice to put trees all over the building and green things on buildings, but that's not what it is. To think like a tree, to have biomimicry is the essence of what I find cool architecture. And there's an architect who's always been doing this. His name is Glenn Murcutt. He's Australian. He's not made many buildings. They're all small buildings, but they work very well, almost like natural systems. The water, the heat, all of this has become a natural thing. It needs very little technical intervention. So he's always made this. How many people work in his office? Two people. Keep small. That's the lesson of Glenn Murcutt. There's another type of cool architecture that you spell with a K, like the menthol cigarettes, cool. And this is by a new generation, somebody like Barks Ingels, who now lives in New York but started in Copenhagen, and makes very cool buildings that often perform very well from a green point of view. And rather than starting from the metaphor of a tree, however, he starts with algorithms. This generation and all of our students think in terms of algorithms, and so we have to keep up with them. It's difficult. I can hardly define algorithm, but this is what is in fact in the mental capacity of all our students. And Big, or Barks Ingels, is a good example of this. So the architecture is cool to look at. It may not be very comfortable. I think of the spaces as being very odd. And in fact, the courtyard, complete waste. So I don't find this a completely successful building from an ecological point of view, but it won the High Rise Award. And if you ask him, he'll tell you that it's a green building. So you could say, okay, it might fit to this. A couple of years ago, I learned about this project. It started in 2011. It is called the Mars One project. It led me to think about how we might be rethinking ourselves, the one-way ticket to planet Earth. Because this project, Mars One, was begun by a developer in Holland who had been thinking of the Big Brother television show, reality shows, and realized that he could finance this incredibly expensive project, which is going to cost billions of dollars, to send 8 astronauts to Mars by 2023. He's working with 3 different universities. It's a real project. It's a serious project. Maybe you've heard about it. He enlisted candidates to become the astronauts. 200,000 people answered from all over the world. They've now reduced this to 100 candidates, and they'll finally reduce it to 8. The trick is they have a one-way ticket to Mars. They will never come back. And I was thinking, we have a one-way ticket to Earth. We can never come back. And maybe we should be thinking about our own planet rather than the Mars planet. You can see that the various wealthy, the 1% of the world, is getting ready to leave the planet. They know that it's going to be extinguished very soon. They built the spaceport in New Mexico. This was publicly financed, but then it has behind it Virgin Galactic. And it was meant to start operating intergalactic flights around the planet 2 years ago, but there was an accident, and so no flights have ever taken off from it, but it's a very cool, with a K, building by Norman Foster. And of course you could analyze it from all sorts of environmental points of view as, yes, working, but working for whom and for what reason? Do we really need this? Norman Foster also entered the NASA competition for a 3D printer colony on Mars. NASA is competing with our Dutch developer to be the first on Mars. And he didn't win the competition, however. This was his idea for a 3D printer development and what you would do inside of this space colony, try to grow some food. This was the winner. Really beautiful project called the Ice House, done by non-famous architects whose name I can't remember. And it's going to be a 3D printer made of ice, if it ever gets built, when they send our colony to Mars. So people are preparing. There was some precedent for this. A Texas billionaire named Ed Bass, financed with only $2 million back in the 1990s, Biosphere 2, to see if it was possible to recreate the ecological conditions of Earth that produce oxygen. And after 2 years, and all the animals died inside of Biosphere 2, and the 8 people, I don't know why it's always 8, but there are 8 people in Biosphere 2, were starting to die as well, and they took them out. So it was declared a failure. And Biosphere, just to say, could we really reproduce the conditions of Earth elsewhere? We'll never be as smart as a tree. That's the problem. So why not deal with what we have? So I guess my first lesson from the world is stay in the world, don't leave it, don't go to Mars. Buckminster Fuller, very enlightened character who I'm sure you're all aware of, in 1968 published this book, The Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, in which he introduced the new metaphor that the planet is in fact ergonomic like a spaceship, and we need to deal with it in terms of its resources rather than making all of the waste that we make. And this was adapted by most people in the environmental movement. So activists started to talk in terms of spaceship Earth, borrowing that from Buckminster Fuller. So if I could come back away from Mars and come back to the world, this is the famous shot called the Blue Marble of 1972. We have imperatives to consider under the new rubric called the Sixth Extinction. I don't know if you're all aware of the previous 5 extinctions that have occurred on the planet, but we're about to experience the 6th extinction, which will be our own extinction, which unfortunately we are partly responsible for, maybe mostly responsible for. Global warming was first identified by this Swedish chemist who won the Nobel Prize. His name is Svante Arrhenius. And he thought that global warming was actually going to be of great benefit because Sweden would be warmer. And maybe they could finally go swimming. And of course, he didn't realize the great damage to the meteorological conditions that global warming has been producing, which we just saw, Kent mentioned in Houston, which is now underwater. He lived in Houston for a few years, so you know that every time it rains in Houston, actually there's a sort of flood. But this is a century flood of great dimensions that is going to take a long time to diminish. Hurricane Harvey. New Orleans had their backlash of global warming in Hurricane Katrina, now 12 years ago. The damage is still there. In other words, New Orleans has never made it back onto the map. So why do I show this? Just to say that we're in trouble through climate change. It's very expensive, this sort of damage. Bordeaux could be affected, for all we know, sometimes. Most cities of the world are going to be affected. And then we have this unmentionable character who has won the election in the United States, who begins denying. He is the great denier. I say we are all deniers, but this is the great denier, because he doesn't want to interrupt the 25 companies that are doing all the drilling, because this, of course, would perhaps damage the idea of development, the idea of the sacrosanct linear economy. The linear economy is what is getting us into all this trouble. Our whole system is based upon waste and not upon coming to a circular economy. And he is in fact hoping that nobody will notice and it'll all just go away and that the planet is going to take care of itself. But read this book and it won't make you happy, The Sixth Extinction, but it's a very good scientific analysis of exactly why the planet is in danger. And it's something that you cannot see. It is the ocean. The ocean is in the most danger of everything on the planet, and we don't see this daily unless you're a surfer. But what you will notice in the ocean is that the pH level, meaning the acidity of the ocean, of the water, is rising, which is going to make it impossible for all sorts of life to continue on the planet. Coral reefs are the first to be affected, so they will be out of the question very soon. They cannot survive in the intense acidity of the new oceans that we are affecting through greenhouse effect, through our producing of carbon dioxides, methanes, and several other gases that are making us live in a different world. You know that the greenhouse effect is necessary. We cannot breathe without it. But what we are experiencing is an exaggeration of the greenhouse effect, which is killing us. And just to look at the two pictures between 1979 and 2007, you realize that Greenland used to be quite different than what it is today. In a very short period, it has shrunk. I'm sure you've read the news about the Antarctic this year that is cracking and is losing bits and pieces that are going into the sea, which is, of course, raising the sea level. The glaciers all over the planet are disappearing. Mount Kilimanjaro, most of the glaciers in Switzerland. Where I grew up in California, there were a couple of glaciers. They're disappeared. In my lifetime, then, I see all of this melting. The planet is melting through global warming. And of course, we get a little upset when you see this map, because if the water level does continue to rise, it's risen 35 centimeters, and it's destined to rise 2 meters. When that occurs, many, many major cities in the world will be in deep trouble. New York City, Dhaka, which is already in trouble, about 70% of the big cities of the planet, London, Paris. Paris had a flood 2 years ago after the COP21. You realize, yes, it will be a different world, a more watery world. A hotter world, a watery world that we need to adjust to. Well, Venice has been teaching us for a couple of centuries how to deal with a watery world, how to become amphibious. You put the planks up, they're a meter high, they have aqua alta. It used to only come a few days a year, now it comes about 30 days a year, and the aqua gets higher every time it comes. So it's going to become a fairly permanent condition for Venice and for other places in the world. So we can adapt to it. This would be a nice way, just take your clothes off and swim through public space. It's a fun way to adapt to it, so we could have a sense of humor about global warming. But of course, the engineers and the linear economy, the great logical positivism behind 19th and 20th century industrialization says, no, we have to produce a strong answer. And this is it. It's called MOSE, M-O-S-E, and it's an extremely expensive, over 6 billion euros. $1 billion of which was sunk into corruption. So 33 people ended up in jail through the corruption behind this project, which maybe have something to do with Italy, but I think it can happen in all countries. The more expensive a project is, the more that it will be corrupt. So listen to Glenn Murcott, think small. Why do we have to think big like this? When you create a barrier like this, where does the water go? It goes somewhere else, so you're only making problem for somebody else. No, we need to rethink, more like a tree. What does a tree do when there's water? Trees think in a different way. They don't think like this. So, you know, I would say as the European Union was against this project, the mayor, Massimo Cacciari, when it was launched, was against the project, but because there was a character named Berlusconi in the government of Italy at the CERN, this is it. High tech. The big tech fix could fix it, just like many people, such as Trump, think that high tech can fix all the damage that we have done. Well, there's news for us. This will be obsolete in 30 years because it was planned for a certain level of water, and the water is going to be higher than the level it was planned for, so it's useless. Why not go to Rotterdam and think about it differently? Rotterdam's the first large city. Of course, it's like Venice, constantly influenced by changing tides, and it is below sea level. It's the first big city that has started to think of itself in terms of a climate change plan. And they've sponsored various projects. This is the first water plots, it's called. It's Bentham Plain is the real name. It's close to the train station. If you go to Rotterdam, you can find it. When it rains, it fills up with water, and then the water is diffused in 36 hours into tanks, into storage tanks, or else into other places where it goes. A lot of the water that during a big rain is collected on the roofs and then used for secondary water uses, like toilets. And this is a diagram of the Bentham Plain system. It's an idea, okay? This is a more passive attempt to solve what is going to be one of the greatest problems for humanity in the next 30 years, flooding. Another idea is to create floating buildings. This is a little more expensive. It cost 2 million euros to produce. It's called the Floating Pavilion. Inside they have all sorts of propaganda about the climate change plan. And the idea is that we could be ready for the floods by having buildings that float. You build the building on a floating foundation. They borrowed a little bit of technology from Buckminster Fuller. They actually improved on Buckminster Fuller. It's a beautiful design. If you look at where the joints are, for instance, the joints are in the middle of the, you see right there? The joints are there and not at the corners, which makes it much easier to join the pieces. So it's a, and this is what it was built on, a floating foundation. Those who are behind the pavilion say that you can build a 15-story building on floating foundations. So we could have, in fact, a very dense city that is floating. And in Lagos, Nigeria, we had the occasion of a school that was built with very little money by a local architect, Kunle Adeyemi, who worked with some Dutch engineers. All of the materials were recycled materials, oil barrels and old pieces of wood, and they put together an A-frame that's floating, and it became, for 3 years, the center of a community that is flooded in the Makoko region of Lagos. The idea is that, yeah, they could actually have a lower tech floating city to compete with the high tech of Rotterdam. But unfortunately, the school was destroyed in a storm. So the wood that was used on it was very cheap wood. So you could say the beginning materials were not strong enough to endure it. But the architect said it was only supposed to last for 3 years, so maybe he's okay, and they'll rebuild. They did rebuild it in Venice. If you went to the Biennale last year, it was rebuilt, the floating school, and they gave a prize to Kunle Adeyemi. The other big problem of the ocean, it's rising, but it's also being damaged irreparably by plastic. This red thing is the plastic island. It's an island that doesn't quite show up on Google Maps, so if you search for it on Google, you won't find it, because it's slightly below the water. It's as large as Australia. All the plastic bottles, maybe you've noticed them when you go to beaches in Greece and other places, there are plastic bottles everywhere. They're accumulating into an indestructible goo that is in the oceans, and that is very damaging to all sea life. Just to look at the Philippines, there's a kind of plastic guano in the Philippines, but you can find this all, I don't want to pick on the Philippines because it happens all over the world. And it's about waste. Well, there's a young designer, so there's hope in the future. He may be thinking in terms of algorithms as well. His name is Boyan Slat, and he's from Holland, and he came up with this concept that you could create a kind of net that can gather all of the old plastic and bring it to shore. And then what should we do with it? Well, that's why I brought this. This is what we should do with it. You can come and see this. This is recycled plastic. It could become one of the great building materials of the future. Not many people are using it, but I'll show you a couple of buildings that have been built with it, and you could say, okay, let's get all of that stuff out of the ocean and recycle it. This character in Colombia is named Oscar Andres Mendez. I don't know him. He's in Bogota. He's been making paneling with the recycled plastic. It's very beautiful. You have to come up and see it afterwards because it's a very interesting material. It almost looks like travertine. And he's successfully put together low-income housing using recycled plastic. So it's a possible material. It's pretty good in compression, not very good in tension. I decided to use it in an exhibition at the Maxi Museum in Rome. It was about food, from the spoon to the world. It was meant to compete with the Expo in Milan. And they let me build a planter for handicapped people. Plants are usually, handicapped people don't have very good access to planting gardens. So this was something you could approach in a wheelchair. It's called the earthworm, but if you look at it, it's made out of this same plastic that a friend of mine and I, Stefano Barbagli, we produced for the exhibition. Okay, 3, we have the consequences of the Anthropocene. I don't know if Anthropocene is in everybody's vocabulary, but it should be. It just means that at some point in history, we can't put our finger on it. It could be from Hiroshima onwards, but it could be before Hiroshima. Human agency is what is determining the geological epoch in which we are living. So we now call it the Anthropocene, meaning human-determined era. And you could say it could have started in 1500. It definitely is present with the pollution of industrialized cities like Manchester and Birmingham. These things which permit us great well-being but great damage from carbon pollution. With it comes architecture. Baku, which was the first drilling for oil in the world by the Nobel brothers who financed the Nobel Prize, has now become the site of what I call hypertexture, a kind of useless architecture mostly for symbolic purposes, to create symbolic capital that goes with the oil economy, which we should say should be on the way out. We should be displacing the oil economy. Those 25 companies should be taxed so that they would disappear or else change to renewables, but they aren't. So we get this kind of architecture, HOK, an American firm. It's pretty, but completely useless, and it's a symbol of the disaster of the Anthropocene. Zaha Hadid, a genius. I don't know if you teach your students to be geniuses, but you know, so you could look at her work as being the work of a genius. But again, a building that I asked a student who's from Azerbaijan, from Baku, what about this building? He said, oh, it's never used. So it's again, it's there as a kind of treasure for the oil economy. To display itself, as is the tallest building in the world, Burj Khalifa, which was empty for 2 years. It now has some people living there. Extremely expensive, $1.5 billion. Do we need this, or is this just a sign of greed? I would say greed has much more to do than need with structures like this. But is it technically competent? Very. So it's very interesting from a technical point of view. And in fact, you can find a lot of these hypertexture buildings, I call them. Renzo Piano produced one in London. I love Renzo Piano, but I don't forgive him for this particular building, the Shard, which is absolutely unnecessary and really just creates a symbol, something like the Tour Eiffel for London. It has a certain claim to sustainability, but is a building that houses billionaires only and has a restaurant that none of us can afford to go to and a hotel that none of us can afford to go to really sustainable? I think not. I don't think it has anything to do with sustainability, but quite the reverse. So I condemn this sort of thing. What it's useful for is keeping an architect's office going. If I said before, Bart Ingels now has 400 people working in his office, Renzo Piano has 600 people who he has to feed. High-rise buildings are the most profitable buildings, maybe some of you know this, of any work of architecture. So, of course, they're going to accept this. He's now accepted another version of the Shard for Amsterdam. I hope it doesn't get built, but I think it will. This building in Shanghai, the Shanghai Tower, second tallest tower in the world, is also LEED platinum. So it's designed by a San Francisco office, Gensler. And you could say, but look, this is really a green building. Isn't this good? But I keep asking, why do we need this building? What is the use of any building like this? I don't understand. To me, it's completely alienating. But this is the system that makes it a green building. So you could say, okay, they get away with it, but they're still contributing to what we call the linear economy. They're still working within the parameters of logical positivism and not of ecological positivism. This is the most important building I'm going to show this evening. Maybe you're aware of it. I hope you are aware of it, because our well-being depends on this building. If this had not been built, we would all be in serious danger. This is the new vault. It's called the new safe confinement, that is covering the disaster of Chernobyl in Pripyat in the Ukraine. And it took nearly 10 years to complete. Mostly French engineers are behind the construction of this building. It had some Italian engineers working on it. The name of any human being is not possible to know. There's a company called Novarka, so we can't say Renzo did this or Bjork did this, but to me this is really cool, because this is in fact keeping the heat inside of Chernobyl. So maybe the coolest building I will show you this evening is this, the new safe confinement. There's a wonderful video about how they moved the building. It was built on a track away from it, then it's pushed over to cover, and it is now, it's not quite complete. They're still missing something like $100 million to complete it, but it will soon be completed, let's hope, because otherwise we cannot live. I won't talk about French nuclear reactors, but you know, accidents do happen. Now, this is the rundown. Let's see, electricity and heat, 25%. Agriculture, 24%. Buildings, 6%. Well, if you had to teach your students, what should you do to be more sustainable? Make more sustainable buildings, or become a vegetarian? The quickest and easiest thing to do is to become a vegetarian. And so, I mean, you can still eat meat, but just eat less meat. This, in fact, would greatly reduce global warming. Making good buildings is a good idea, but really we need to work on agriculture. We need to work on the 25 companies that are producing the heat and all the energy. We can make, yes, we can make sustainable buildings. This was a good beginning. Ken Yang, who from Kuala Lumpur, built the Shanghai Tower back now 20 years ago. It became the model for a more famous tower, the Gherkin in London by Norman Foster. He basically stole the patent for this to create a sustainable high-rise. Again, sustainable, I don't know, because it's only for business. What kind of business? The business that has to do with the linear economy, so I don't know if it's sustainable. I can't perhaps back it. We have buildings covered with greenery. They're not designed like a tree, but they're covered with trees. This was the first of a tendency by Emilio Ambas in Fukuoka in Japan. It's a municipal building. In France, you have Patrick Blanc, who does these beautiful mosaics of jungle plants that are attached to walls, like the Musée Branly in Paris, or in Madrid he did another one. Renzo did this, which was the first building that got an LEED rating, a platinum rating. It's in my hometown of San Francisco, the California Academy of Sciences, and it's covered with a green roof that has nice hills on it, but of course a rather extravagant, very expensive, and not particularly natural project, but I like it. This has been very popular in Milan, where I'm teaching now, by my friend Stefano Boeri. It's called the BOSCO Vertical, vertical forest, and it's covered with 1,600 trees. Now, first of all, we know that trees grow. If those trees keep growing, won't they push through the balconies? Well, the secret of this is the people, the millionaires who live here, by the way, because it's very expensive, sign a contract that they're not allowed to touch the plants in their planters. Because the gardener will come once a week and trim the roots. So the plants are actually bonsai, Japanese. So, you know, it's not so natural after all. But people love this building. I was on the bus today coming here, and I took a picture from the bus, and a lady next to me said, So obviously this pleases, and it's a good lesson to all architects. People dislike architecture. They like trees and greenery. And it's a good lesson. And Stefano has had incredible success after this building. They've now hired him. This is a kind of diagram of what it is. So I don't call this thinking like a tree at all, but it's got trees all over it. And Now he's been hired to do another one in Lausanne and a huge project in China. I think he's loosening up a little bit on the placement of the trees, so you can see they don't have to be bonsais. He could have taken lessons from this really brilliant Vietnamese architect, Vo Trong Nha, who has for many years earlier been working with trees, trying to integrate trees into all of his architecture. So it became his thing. And he's much more successful. I think he understands more what a tree is, let's say, and how trees grow. They need very deep planters for their roots. And this is inside of his house, the tree house in Ho Chi Minh City, once known as Saigon. Those companies, the great digital tycoon companies, Apple, for instance, is now finishing. It will be finished any minute. Norman Foster's, well, this could have been built on Mars, might have been better. It is the Great Circle for Apple. It has 12,000 employees, so you can imagine nobody will ever know anyone in a building like this. And it's scheduled to have a bosque inside of it, a wood, so it will be very green. This is the idea, very green. Is it really sustainable, and what are the Apples doing to us? What is Microsoft doing to us? What are all these digital companies doing to us? Well, they're helping us, of course, improve our intelligence. We all become much more intelligent using digital means. There's no doubt about this. But they're also taking something from us. And this something is probably called consciousness. So you're losing, a historian called Yuval Hariri says, there's a decoupling of intelligence from consciousness. Our students never go to the movies. Have you noticed that? They look on Netflix and they look only on computers. If there's ever a question, first you go to a computer, the student goes to the computer. They're quite eager to be involved with intelligence, but not necessarily with consciousness. Consciousness is an old-fashioned thing that we have, but that will be difficult for them to obtain. So as a teacher, what can you do? Perhaps make a critical moment when you realize, okay, that's only intelligence, that's only algorithms, it's not consciousness. Consciousness is what helps you decide what's right and wrong. Consciousness will get us out of this. There's Mark Zuckerberg with Frank Gehry making a very green headquarters in Menlo Park, covered with greenery to disguise the building. Nobody will know it's there. It's an immense building, again, for 10,000 people to work in. And next door, Zuckerberg, a very young guy, he's the fourth richest person on the planet, has hired now Rem Koolhaas's office to produce a little town called Willow Campus, which might be embarrassing for Rem Koolhaas to see something like this, I don't know. But it obviously has to do with the taste of the client, who wants everything to look nice, human dimension, Facebook idea of... but the problem with all of these projects, the hypertexture projects or our digital economy projects, is that they are going in a straight line. They're going in the line that we call full throttle development. And they're not coming back. Okay, a few years ago, this book, Cradle to Cradle, which is it's not a great book, but it's a good title. We need to know where things start and how to get them back to where they started from. This should be one of the first questions that every designer asks, but very few. When you talk to the students and they made a drawing and you say, what's that made of? Well, it's a line, concrete. There's no question. Where does the concrete come from and where's the concrete going? I don't know. But there seems to be no alternative because they're not being invited into the cradle-to-cradle mentality. This was produced by a colleague in Milan, one of the more sustainable public housing projects in Italy, Fabrizio Rossi Prodi, and it's made almost completely in wood, biodegradable materials, very little concrete in this project. So you could say somebody's trying, somebody's attempting to move towards a more sustainable system, a more cradle-to-cradle system. Here in Bordeaux, there's another lesson to learn. Maybe you've noticed this since you've been here. It's called the Grand Parc. It's being revised. And the great lesson behind this is conservation. Rather than tearing down these ugly public housing buildings that were built in the 60s and 70s, which have very good foundations and are very strong and would be very expensive to demolish, Lacatan and Vassal have said, do as little as possible. They're very zen. They say, try not to do anything. And if you do something, just add a little bit. Give people a little bit more space. So what they've done is wrapped the buildings here and in Paris with a greenhouse of sorts that gives 2 meters of space to every apartment and makes the apartment feel a little bit better. The people who live here didn't have to move out. It's amazing, and no gentrification occurs. So you get ugly buildings that are perhaps replaced by ugly buildings. I don't know, it's not beautiful, but it's very practical and a good lesson. Conserve what we have. This is what they get in exchange. A kind of nice patio. I've talked to people who live there, they like it, they really have benefited from this. So the best person working today is working in Burkina Faso, although his office is in Berlin. His name is Francis Kéré. He's the son of the chief of Gando. So he had a head start, let's say, in the aristocracy of his place, a little village. And he was able to produce a whole series of wonderful buildings that combine first world and third world technology. The third world technology is completely biodegradable materials of mud and straw. The first world technology has to do with steel and roofs, because the most difficult thing in a climate like this is the roof. How can you make the roof work so that you don't need air conditioning? He's done a very good job about this and has continued. It's under construction. You can see with a simple system of rebars that have been bended, he's been able to create a double roof that lets the air pass through, and a few wonderful spaces. So we could say, yes, we have really good examples. It's a little far to go to Burkina Faso to see this. Could we do this back home? I don't know whether people would really want this kind of thing in Bordeaux or Milan, but sustainable urbanism, a contradiction in terms. More important than buildings is in fact the city. The city is upon us. We agree since 2004 that 50% of the planet are so-called urban. Urban in what sense? Are they living in cities? I doubt it. They're living in suburbs, sprawl, and in shanties. The majority of these people are growing up in places that are not in Europe and not in the United States, but are in South America, Africa, and Asia. And they have proportions that are unconscionable. Tokyo being the biggest, 34 million, but when you look at China, you'll find they have 100 cities of more than 1 million people, and many of these cities, like Chongqing, have 30 million people. A little hard to understand. How do you plan for 30 million people? How can we bring down to the scale of Glenmurcutt a place like this? How can we think like a tree? Back in the 70s, an architect mayor of Curitiba understood the environmental message of Buckminster Fuller. He'd been trained about this and said, well, the first thing is transportation. Less waste in transportation. If we could create bus lanes instead of digging in the ground to make subways, it's much cheaper and people can travel, and the poor people don't have to buy tickets. They can exchange garbage to be recycled for bus tickets. This was a brilliant idea. It's still an excellent example of how to reorganize a city through transportation. Transportation is the key. Bordeaux, like dozens of European cities, has just undergone a major change that is very successful, a new tramway that helps people now go on foot, where it wasn't possible before. There were some buses and things, but now a tramway really works very well, and it had a windfall benefit, which was the remaking of the quays of the river, which led to, I feel, a masterpiece that was meant to be seen like this, the mirror, to reflect the Place La Bourse. And then it got transformed into something else that became one of the most popular and coolest places in the world, where people really love to be. I have to finish. I'm just about at the end. Go to Freiburg, Germany. You can find that places have been designed with the ethic of the garden city, with great deal of participation. We make solar neighborhoods that produce more energy than they consume. Rolf Disch is the architect behind this particular one. It's a very agreeable place. The people are obviously happy when you go to visit there. They've organized their garbage, they've organized their bicycles in such a way that it becomes beautiful. So I find it very cool. We have a chance here in Bordeaux, the Ginkgo neighborhood. It's one of several, 6 eco-quartiers being built in France. It's top-down, so the people don't exist. They didn't participate in creating this. It's through planners, Christian Devilliers and Olivier Brochet, and it's next to the tram line, and it has a very good system, a cogeneration system of a biomass incinerator that produces heat for the neighborhood. The future of the land. Is our system of sustainability equal between economy, society, and environment? Well, if the trees do not continue to exist, it's not. So I would say the environment is what encompasses everything. Frank Lloyd Wright, the American architect, had an idea that Broadacre City could be an alternative, that every American could have an acre of land and do whatever they like and become farmers. He made the students who worked for him in Taliesin East farm so that he could eat the food. They thought they were going to do architecture. Instead, they had to farm. And they still do at the Taliesin Fellowship. This is Broadacre City. It's the beginning of an idea that cities could be considered in terms of agriculture. In Milan, we have the world's first Parco Agricolo. It has been planned in 1972, but officially begun in 1990. It's not a complete success, but it's a great concept, and it's one that I would like all of you to take away. Every city, Bordeaux included, could be considered as agriculture first, planting rather than planning. That we start with the agriculture, and instead of replacing agriculture, we start with agriculture. I call this agritecture. So the Parco Agricolo Sud is a wonderful example of maintaining, conserving the agriculture environment so close to the center of the city. This is some of the buildings that were built by students with Carlo Mazera inside of the agricultural park. In China, there's a agricultural college where the students harvest the rice paddies to learn about different types of qualities of rice, and it becomes a very decorative landscape. But I would say here agriculture has been inserted as a prime protagonist. The winners of this year's Pritzker Prize, RCR architects, made a wonderful project that I visited called the Belloc Winery, and there the roof structure actually supports vineyards. So they've combined architecture and agriculture. Our great Vietnamese architect Vo Trong Nha has made the agricultural kindergarten where the children go onto the roof to learn about plants. So you could say there are people getting there. Another way to get there is to think that the products of agriculture can become the materials of architecture. A friend of mine near Ancona, Michele Ricci, has produced a series of row houses that look like normal row houses. I wouldn't say this is Zaha Hadid or genius design. It's just a good design that's made of straw bales. The interior of the house is this. So it can look quite normal, but it's made of agricultural materials. And other friends who've been working in Gaza for the Bedouin population, who's discriminated by both the Israelis and the Palestinians, produced out of the sand of the area in sandbags this first school. It's called the al-Nazer School. Arco is the name of the office with Mario Cucinella, and it was destroyed in 2014 because the Israeli army thought that it was a liability, that terrorists could be hiding inside of this school, so they destroyed it. But the good news is they rebuilt it, but they rebuilt it in a little bit stronger materials using mud bricks and what's called the pitch brick vault technique. With my students over the last years, I've been trying to get them involved in planting, agriculture. We go and make gardens. And recently one student won a competition to make straw bale buildings, so we started. We made a foundation with river stones. We got the hay from the local farmers, the straw. This is Michele Ricci, the guy who made the condominiums, who's helping us put together the straw bales, and in 8 hours produced a house, a little house. We called it the Playhouse, together with 4 refugees who came from different countries in Africa, who loved building, who said, this is what we do back in Africa. So it was a very strange experience of students who were learning to do high-tech things and Africans who have always worked with low-tech things. And we could say, the student who organized this won a competition to try to combine high-tech or a higher tech with a lower tech, to make prefabricated structure into which you could insert farming materials, straw bales. And this is the second version of Agri-Shelter, which has now been torn down. But it's just an example of, and there she is getting into her house, and I'll show her pictures. She's quite beautiful. But it's the idea, my hope is here, in people like this that are trying to do things differently, that are trying to say, we don't have to build in concrete. We don't have to accept all these old ways of doing things. A line is not necessarily concrete. It could be straw. It could be wood. It could be biodegradable materials. These people give me hope. And so I end by saying that cool architecture should help us encourage a circular economy, this for sure. It should get us away from the linear economy. It should move us towards bioclimatic design. That would be a good thing. Bioregional planning for the city. So even if people like Trump don't think it's happening, and maybe it's a big hoax, like he says, we would actually have a better world if we built this way. It would be a more comfortable world, and it would be a world full of participation. I end with a message that comes from the past of Le Corbusier. You probably know this. He said, architecture or revolution, revolution can be avoided. He obviously thought that architecture was very, very important, and that this was going to determine the future of the world. And he puts an enigmatic image of the Briar pipe, which is not a piece of architecture, but is a cancer-causing thing, industrial product, to say that industry produced this. Why can't we make buildings made with the great techniques of industry that are as good as a pipe? I propose this, architecture or extinction. Extinction can be avoided. And I give you this, my Panama hat that's made out of recycled paper to say we could sort of change the story. And I hope that you will change your stories and that we can encourage our students to be open, to be more flexible, to realize that the world is in a great moment, that in fact it's not depressing. It is one of the few times in history we could say, we know what to do. It's very easy. We know what to do. We can move and change things. Thank you.